Welcome to Sasquatch, the show all about Bigfoot in the great state of Alaska. I'm your host, Beans Baxter. So lace up your boots, zip up your coat, and come with me on an adventure as we explore all things cryptid in the last frontier. All right, everybody, we are here and we have a special guest with us today via the magic of the internet. You're in Healy? Is it Healy?
Healy, Alaska.
Healy, Alaska, which is very, very far away from me. We have Norm Sollie, and he's here to talk about his new book, this newest release, which I have in my fat little hands right now. I just finished it last night.
Yay.
And the name of this book is Before Patty, Volume 1. Patrick, the Sasquatch human hybrid and our genetic inheritance. That is a mouthful of a title, Norm. Do you have any like shorthand for that, or you just call it Patrick?
I call it Before Patty Volume 1 because it's actually a three-book series.
I know. I noticed in the book a couple of times you're like, we're going to talk about this in Volume 2 and this in Volume 3. And
yep, it's coming. I'm working on the 2 already.
I finished it yesterday in preparation for this. And I got to tell you, man, I am amazed at the attention to detail, the amount of research that went into this. But we'll get into that here in a little bit. First, let's tell the people. I mean, obviously, the title gives people a hint about what it's about. But if you want, in your own words, give us the Reader's Digest version of Before Patty Volume 1.
Certainly. So what happened, Beans, is through a chain of odd circumstances, I heard about a paper published by Ed Fouche in 1992 that included within it a case of an Indian woman on the Colville Reservation in Washington State being abducted in the early 1890s by what they call a scanicum, which is their word for Sasquatch. She was gone for a couple of months and managed to escape. The thing is, she escaped pregnant. And as you can imagine, that's a little startling for those of us. I grew up on the elusive mountain ape side of things. That's how I was trained to think of Sasquatch. An elusive mountain ape probably can't impregnate a Homo sapiens woman. But in this case, that Indian woman was pregnant and she ended up bearing a child. And it was a male child. They named him, oddly enough, and I did not make this up, they named him Patrick. What could be more perfect? We got Patty and Patrick, and thus Before Patty. Before Patty, there was Patrick. They named him Patrick. He ended up through incredible deprivations and challenges on that reservation, including a smallpox epidemic, of all things. He survived to adulthood and he ended up marrying. He owned land. He registered for 2 drafts and he had 8 children. And some of those children had children. So when I refer to our genetic inheritance, the last part of that title, I'm referring to the fact that I literally believe that there is Sasquatch DNA in our population in North America today from this one event. Probably there already was some, but definitely from this one event.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you talk about abductions perpetrated by Sasquatch, I mean, it's not an uncommon theme in the subject. People talk about it all the time. Of course, the one you mentioned in the book several times, the Albert Ostman tale, and there's others. There's a few from here in Alaska I've heard. I can't remember I believe it was somewhere up north where the lady was, I think she was picking berries or something. She was abducted, taken to, I believe, a cave, and there was a sick Sasquatch, and the other Sasquatch were like, somehow they conveyed to her that this Sasquatch was sick, and she gave him some, mixed up some medicinal herbs, and nursed it back to health. And then they took her. I don't know if they took her back home or they just let her go.
Huh.
But yeah,
I wish I'd heard about that one.
I can't remember. It may be one of the stories in that newspaper, the Delta Discovery, maybe.
Huh.
They have they occasionally have native tales of Bigfoot in that newspaper. I'll see if I can find it. But I mentioned it in an episode, I don't know, like a long time ago. But I remember it. And it's one of the few, where you have someone abducted, but then they're like, help Bobby over here, like he's sick.
Yeah.
Usually it's kind of more like the Osman account where you're kind of captured and held for a while. And, we talk about, and you talk about in the book how, she came back and she was with child. And, a lot of these accounts from back in the day, that kind of stuff's not mentioned. They don't talk about like what happened. I think there was one account where a male gentleman was abducted, and he says that he was forced to copulate with a female Sasquatch. I believe you mentioned that account in the book.
I did. It was, well, he was vague. The story is vague about it, but there were two females from Mongolia, if that's the one you're thinking about. There's a really harsh one from Northern California where the man was recovered alive, but he died soon after. But he told the story first. That was a hard story.
Yeah, and a lot of these people that are abducted, they're not very giving on the details about what happened a lot of times. And a lot of times I think maybe it may be for breeding purposes or something like that, and they're just not brought up. I was telling you a little bit earlier, right before we started, about how, one of the things I learned when I went through a lot of my training in law enforcement to investigate those kind of crimes was, you have barriers to reporting. And, you may have someone who's a victim of a crime like that, and they don't want to report it because it's embarrassing, or, maybe their abuser was somebody important in the community, or they're, the breadwinner of the house, and they can't, bear to lose the breadwinner of the house. So there's a lot of barriers to that kind of thing when it comes to that kind of crime, when it comes to that kind of thing. And, I think with a lot of these abduction cases, we may be looking at the exact same thing. There's these barriers to where, yeah, I'm going to tell them what happened, but I'm not going to tell them everything that happened.
That makes sense.
In the case of Patrick, to bring it back to Patrick, when his mother, she literally, it's something out of a movie. It probably would make a great movie. She is literally rescued on horseback and whisked away. She sees some of her tribesmen, down the hill ways, and basically runs to them. And it's like something out of a movie. I can just imagine she's probably like looking behind her. She's running down the hill like, oh Lord, I hope he doesn't hear me go,
Yeah.
and she gets out of there. But, nowhere in that part of the story is very detailed. It's very, there's a lot of information in there, but then it's just, okay, she's rescued, and she doesn't talk much about her time with the Sasquatch and what happened. I think she talks a little bit about like, oh, he would watch me, and then maybe he'd bring me food or something, but he wouldn't let me get very far away. Or sometimes when he'd nap, I'd go away, but when I'd get too far away, or when I'd stop doing, digging for food or grubs or something, he would like come and find me. But other than that, there's not a whole lot of information. And I think, probably, especially back then, people were a lot more prudish and conservative than they are now. I think there might be some of those types of barriers that we run into with people talking about, forced situations like that. I'm afraid I'm dancing around some words here because I don't want our video to get like buried or, taken off the internet. But people can use their imaginations and figure it out. We're talking about a lady that probably had a baby with a Bigfoot here.
Yeah, and keep in mind also, Beans, the information I had was from interviews in 1985 about an event that happened, I believe, in 1891. So there was almost 100 years. So there was very little solid information associated with what Ed Foosh was being told by informants, as they called them, on the Caldwell Reservation. So when I wrote those two chapters you're referring to, I had a skeleton of a narrative, and then I really had to make it historical fiction and just do the best job I could with the few facts that I knew. So that's what I did. I have very little information beyond that during Patrick's upbringing as to how she felt. I was able to find many historical documents, newspaper articles, obituaries, arrest records, etc., that fills in the story somewhat. Um, but we can only speculate that there was, as you say, one of the barriers was social stigma. It's bad enough what she went through. It's bad enough she's pregnant, but how she got pregnant, what impregnated her. You imagine having something like that in your little town. Homer's a little town. You know how rumors roar through town. So I believe he was actually born off reservation, and I believe that that was a deliberate attempt to kind of hide the fact that she became pregnant during that period in which she was gone. I think they tried, and it probably didn't work great. I imagine most local residents understood what Patrick was, but it might have worked, particularly with like the Indian agent, et cetera, and his staff. They might not have figured it out. So Patrick didn't come back to the reservation until after he was born. I think they probably waited until he was about 6 months old, and tried to say he was only 3 months old to pawn it off a little bit. But I don't know. I'm just
Yeah.
speculating.
Well, that was a common thing back then, where a young girl, finds herself with child. Maybe she's not married, maybe she's in a situation like that. Where nowadays it's not that big a deal. Back then it was. So she would go somewhere for about a year. She'd go visit family, or something like that, and then she would show back up a year later, usually like with a husband and a baby. And but the baby was there before the husband was. But nobody there knows that. She just shows back up and she's got the baby and a boyfriend or husband now.
Yeah, I thought that might be the basic story with Patrick as well.
Yeah, and it makes sense, especially for that time. But yeah, it's interesting how this story, how it unfolds, and just some of the things that you uncovered. I'm actually pretty envious at all the information you had at your fingertips, even though it wasn't as much as we would like to have. It was still a windfall of information, especially when you consider, like up here in Alaska, like investigating something like Port Chatham. People just don't understand. There's just wasn't that type of government infrastructure, that type of documentation going on up here. Down in Washington, though, there was. Tell us about some of the documentation you found.
Well, it started with I found Indian census materials. Oddly enough, at that time, every year they did a fairly thorough census of everybody on the reservation, and these are still available electronically. So having the bare bones of the story with some names in it in that Ed Foosh paper, uh, I and Heather Moser before me, and you were part of that, Beans, because she reported originally to the Boreal Bigfoot Research Group, which you are a part of, and you got to hear her initial presentation. And she, within like 48 hours of getting Ed's paper, she thought she'd found him. And I deliberately told her, and I think she supported that, don't tell us the last name, because I'm still very concerned about living descendants getting harassed over this, particularly considering what they might be carrying in their blood. So she didn't give me a last name. Eventually, though, I decided I was going to dig in it too. So I went through the same process. I got a subscription to a genealogical platform, and very quickly, there he is. And I found him through Indian census materials. I found a person that was born about the right time in the right town. He was the only person with that name of Patrick in that town. He had this little twist of being born off reservation, even though his parents were reservation residents. Um, and I found what's called even a delayed birth registration for him. And that was interesting because it showed him being born when I think he was first brought back to the reservation rather than his actual year of birth. So I think they did a good job of confusing the authorities about when he was born. Um, Indian census, I found newspaper articles. I found a land patent. Um, this guy, Patrick, he ended up owning 104 acres of land. They called him a grain rancher, which is kind of a weird mix of terms. I suspect it meant that he had some horses, maybe a few cattle, but that he also raised grains, which was typical at that point on the reservation. This land patent was signed by President Woodrow Wilson. I think to me that just blows my mind. I doubt if it was what do they call it, the auto pen? I doubt if they had an auto pen at that point. I suspect President Woodrow Wilson signed this document for a half Sasquatch. I mean, if this ever goes to court, that's like a way to say, oh, we got to accept this as a real human being because he's already been recognized as such by the President of the United States. I know that wouldn't necessarily stand up, but it would be an interesting tactic to take. He married. They said in that original paper he had no trouble marrying, not because of his ugly looks. They acknowledged he was weird looking, but because he was very intelligent and he was good at the farming. He had no trouble making a living that way. So he attracted a wife named Louise. Um, they started having kids. The first male child only lived about 6 years, which is sad. Um, but they had some kids. In fact, um, they had a lot of kids in the end, 8 kids. Patrick outlived all but, I think there's a lot in that book, but 2 of them. And going back to your comment about all the evidence, part of the reason I put so much in the book is the old thing about extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. I felt I had to put basically everything I found in that book just to show that I was basing my belief on a great deal of evidence. But when you get right down to it, it is belief. I have convinced myself, but I didn't meet Patrick. I haven't looked at any genetic studies from today that show Sasquatch DNA, whatever that might be, bouncing around in our population. But I did the research. I can compare my research with what Ed Fouche wrote about. Poor Ed Fouche was ignored about all this in 1992, although eventually he did get interviewed by Rhett Bigfoot. No, the link's in the book. I've forgotten his name, but he did 2 years before he died. He was interviewed. Supposedly it was videotaped, and I wish I could see that. I have not been able to track it down. So somewhere it's out there. I hope this book maybe brings that back to light, and we can hear a little bit more about this. So I put in a lot of evidence, and I don't expect people to believe me. It just might make them think, could be. And if you at all accept the possibility that Sasquatch can interbreed with humans, that's a domino effect of other things you have to consider, including that they probably belong in the Homo line of hominins. rather than just being classified as an unknown hominid, um, which is what I believe. Just look at that original abduction account. I find that so interesting that after a couple months of captivity, this Scanicum felt he could take a nap in the bushes while he had this poor Indian woman digging up tubers for him, Indian potatoes. Uh, that
So,
shows a little bit of complicated thinking and probably storage for the future, for the
so you're
winter.
telling me the patriarchy has invaded the Bigfoot world as well?
I think it is, yeah. Well, you know how it is. I mean, who's the boss at your house, really? um,
The dogs.
well, okay, they probably are. I got a dog
Mm.
too. Uh, but when it comes to interactions with the outside world, yeah, I suspect the males in the Sasquatch groups are dominant.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting case. And I'm a field guy. I like getting out. I like going to the field. I like stuff I can look, see, touch. Collect. And when I read this book, the first thing I'm thinking is like, we got to find these people. We got to find them, and we got to check their DNA. Uh, but I think you're right. At the end of the book, you're like, we need to leave these people alone, let them live their lives, and just accept it, for what it is. But I think if we did that, I think if we did track one of them down and get them to consent to a DNA uh, analysis, honestly, I don't know that we would learn anything more. I mean, it wouldn't be something. I don't think that we could pass their DNA off to some lab, and the lab would come back and be like, they've got Sasquatch DNA. They'll just be like, oh yeah, there's some kind of like, you know, some kind of DNA in there. We're not really sure what it is, but it's probably some kind of a, like a Neanderthal DNA or something like that. Whatever, or it could be a fluke. I don't, I don't think it would lead to any more answers. Honestly, I really don't.
It probably wouldn't. I agree with you. I mean, that's what's happened to DNA so far. It goes to the lab and it comes back maybe unknown primate. It comes back human, which, that's my whole point. It should come back human. Human in the sense of in the Homo line. I literally believe that. I think we're a
Yeah.
mongrel race.
Well, I've wondered that. There's been a couple of times, and I can't for the life of me remember exactly when, but there's been a couple of times where there's been some things sent off that I'm like, this is it. This is big. And it comes back, oh, it must have been contaminated. It was human DNA.
Well, I think that's really to be expected. What genetic testing might show is unusual haplogroups, um, groupings of genetic mutations um, that perhaps would happen to line up with maybe some of Ketchum's better genetic testing. And I suspect some of her testing, maybe it did get a little messed up. Um, but even Haskell, I think his last name, he wrote a failed DNA study, something like that. He admitted there were a couple samples in there that were very interesting, and he actually felt bad that those weren't being looked at more carefully because he thought, well, these are unusual.
Yeah.
So, maybe it would match up with some of those odd things that Ketchum did find, or maybe with some of the hair samples. Um, maybe
Yeah.
not.
Well, I have that. I have swabs from that handprint at Area A. I guess as far Darby Orcutt has them right now. I don't know what their status is. I don't know if I'll ever know, honestly. I seem to be the last one that nobody's going to think to call me. They'll call Alex probably and tell him.
Uh,
But I I'm like I think it's 50-50. It's either going to come back inconclusive or it's going to come back human. But then again, if it does come back human, what kind of human? I just wonder sometimes because I know I collected that swab like exactly like I would at a crime scene. There is no way that it was
yeah.
contaminated by me. But the problem is I wasn't there before. I was called in a few days after the fact to collect it. So I don't know. I mean, I don't think any of Alex or the guys that were out there, they probably weren't like spitting on it or breathing on it too close. Hopefully they weren't like, look at that, like uh, throwing saliva flecks on it while they were, like looking at it. I mean, you don't know, you weren't there,
It comes
but
back, Alex.
yeah. Well, that's another thing. Like, if we really wanted to get into it, we could take elimination swabs from everybody that was out there and compare them. But that's a lot. That's a lot of time and effort, and that's very expensive. So that's not likely to happen. It's either going to come back human or it's going to come back not human. But
I remember that well, and I watched the Small Town Monsters episode about that greasy print. In the book, I did a lot of research of Earth hunter-gatherer societies looking for parallels with Sasquatch. And one thing that really caught my eye is the Tasmanians, which were a really interesting group of people. Uh, they essentially went nude all the time, down to temperatures of, I think, about 24 degrees Fahrenheit. And one of the ways that they dealt with the cold, they would smear themselves with animal fats, and it would give them a little extra protection from the cold. And when I heard that, I wondered, we get occasional reports of like greasy looking faces of Sasquatch. I wonder if they do the same thing. And if maybe these persistently greasy prints really aren't going to come back with Sasquatch DNA. They might come back with bear suet DNA or something.
yeah,
If that's what's really going on, and that's why they persist and look so greasy.
that's an interesting theory. And I think Doug Hychek calls it Alba Varnix or something like that. He
Is
he
that,
he thinks it's like grease on their skin, like that they produce.
yeah,
But no, that's something that I haven't really thought about. Is it could be some type of protective coating or something they put on themselves to protect them from cold, or even to like wax themselves to keep them, the water, because they're in a rainforest a lot of times. So maybe it's like a waxy coating they use to turtle wax so that they stay drier.
maybe they're trying to avoid premature aging wrinkles. Who
Well,
knows?
you don't get volume like that from Head and Shoulders. You've got to really work at it.
The amount of shampoo they must go through.
But no, Norm, that's an amazing theory, and I've never heard anybody else float that. I think that you might be onto something there. It's in the search for Sasquatch DNA, I don't necessarily think we can discount that they're probably covered in all kinds of crap, literally and figuratively, and it might be one of the reasons why we've had such a hard time getting a successful DNA sample.
Oh yeah, I mean, you've heard the stories of them carrying off a deer or an elk with blood just pouring down them. They must be quite a mix of DNA. Yeah.
Yeah, and you've heard the stories about them smelling. I've heard that they smell like horses or animals, zoo smell, stuff like that. And I can't imagine that they, a lot of the greater apes and they do grooming behavior. But I'm curious now, has there ever been a sighting of a Bigfoot that involves some kind of grooming behavior, or maybe some kind of like cleansing or something like that? I mean, I've heard about them in the water, but I've never heard of anybody like, yeah, they were like sitting there like picking nits off each other or something. I've never heard anything like that.
And yet, and I agree, and yet we get reports, people will say, it looked like he was freshly combed. They will literally say, just silken flowing hair. He looked beautiful. And some are completely disgusting, like they've been rolling around in a swamp and then rolled in
Yeah.
chicken feathers or something.
Well, it could be the difference between those that are in troops or family groups and those that are maybe not in a group or a family group. The more disheveled ones might not have anybody to do any grooming, and then the ones that are a little bit more presentable maybe do have a family group or a companion to go back to.
It is interesting you bring up that issue of why do we not see certain things? You're right, we don't see grooming. We don't, I don't, I recall maybe one account of them trying to get rid of mosquitoes around them or something. But you'd think like a horse is besieged by flies, a caribou, a moose, etc. They're around them all the time. We don't really hear about that with Sasquatch. I recall one account of people in a tent hearing one peeing, but they didn't see it urinating. It urinated on the tent, but we don't really see them urinating. We don't see them defecating. We don't see them copulating. Presumably, they do all of those things. It's just interesting the things we don't see.
Yeah. Well, I think it was a couple of shows ago. I had Dan Toth on, and he thinks he found some feces, and he has a picture where it's on like on the side of a road, where there's like a couple of like heel marks almost. He's like it looks like it's squatted. It literally looks like it's squatted and pooped. You can see the heel marks, and then there's the feces, and it it looks somewhat bear like, but it also doesn't.
I,
It's
I've I've had two occasions of scat. I didn't mean to say we don't find scat. I just mean
Yeah.
we don't see them
Nobody
in the
sees it.
process
Yeah.
of making scat. But I also have had two occasions, and one I could see footprint impressions flanking the material. Uh, that was on thin snow on a frozen stream.
Yeah.
Uh, it was an
Well,
excellent place.
Rob and I found that strange scat at Area A, and it wasn't. It definitely didn't look like bear scat. I mean, it looked like it was a loaf, like a about that big around.
Yeah.
And I wish I could have found something to do with that, but I could nobody wants to get poop in the mail, Norm. I don't know what's going on with these people.
You wrote about that in
Yeah.
Squatch Cop.
Yeah.
That
It's
was
actually
hilarious.
it's kind of hard to get people to look at poop. I talked to my local vet one time, and I was like, "Hey, if I bring in some like poop, will you guys check it for parasites?" And they're like, "Why? Do you think something's wrong with your dogs?" And I'm like, "No, it's like I'm talking about like if I find some suspected like Sasquatch poop," and they're like, we're not really qualified to do that." um,
Yeah, they probably aren't. Uh, was there anything unusual? Did you take the poop apart to see what was in it, or?
I don't think he touched it or collected it, but I'll send you the photo if I can dig it up. It's around here somewhere. But yeah, it looked kind of like bear scat, but not. It was very interesting. I think he actually did show it to Dr. Meldrum, and Dr. Meldrum was, you know, he didn't say it wasn't Bigfoot poop, and he didn't say it was bear scat. He said it was very intriguing, and there was something else to that story too, where he heard something the night before or saw something the night before. I don't remember exactly, but there's a little bit
Oh,
more to the story than just
yeah.
finding the poop.
Huh.
But
So that might have been poop with a message.
maybe. Well, they seem to be interested in human poop too, because Scott had um, his outhouse had the toilet seat ripped off more than once, and flung into the woods, and there was never any like claw marks or anything like that. It was just on the the seat on the box that you go to the bathroom in,
Yeah.
just with a couple of wood screws, and something just ripped it off and threw it into the woods and didn't leave a mark on it. I can't imagine a bear doing that,
No.
pulling out some wood screws without leaving some claw marks, teeth marks, or something.
No. No. It makes you wonder what was the message there. I don't think they liked them using that throne.
Yeah, I concur. I think that they're probably just like anybody else when it comes to that kind of stuff. They're like, don't poop in my yard. And I think a lot of times you'll see or hear about like, oh, I went and relieved myself and I saw one, or saw one after I went to the bathroom. I think usually that's when they're like, okay, that's enough. We got to get them out of here. They're peeing on the furniture now. Um, but
Yeah, I talked to a woman who had such an experience. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, that would be pretty frightening.
yeah.
Pretty
Well,
startling.
bringing it back to Patrick, I've spent some time around Colville, Washington. I've never been to the reservation, obviously, but I've spent some time squatching down there, and let me tell you, that is a squatchy place.
Oh yeah.
There's if I won the lottery right now and just could do whatever I wanted, I'd buy an RV and I'd just go hang out there like all the time. I don't know if I'd buy a house there, but I would go there and squatch a lot because I think that's a good place for it. We went to and Bigfoot Encounters of the Pacific Northwest. We were, I don't know, 15, 20 miles from Colville at that lake. And it was insane. I mean, there was knocks, screams, howls. We found tracks. And I think it's a very squatchy place. I think it's probably everybody talks about Western Washington and Olympic Peninsula, but I think Eastern Washington, as far as squatching goes, I think it gets slept on. I think people don't realize like what's going on there in the Washington, like Idaho border area. There's a lot of squatchy stuff going on there.
Yeah, I hear a lot from northern Idaho, definitely. Northeast Washington, quite a bit.
And another thing, Will Ulmer, who is Stevens County, Bigfoot of Stevens County, he's had several sightings reported to him where the Bigfoot it doesn't look like Patty. It doesn't look like the big lumbering, ape with football pads, for shoulders on. He's had several encounters reported to him where, there was scrawny, smaller, more human-sized Sasquatch seen.
Oh, really?
And he's found several sets of tracks that he's shown, to other investigators that have kind of got gotten ignored because they didn't necessarily have the mid-tarsal break. And it's like, man, this dude, he's out in the middle of nowhere in the wilderness of Washington. You find a barefoot track like next to this lake. Yeah. I think one set he found was like child's tracks, like very small.
Yeah, and there's got to be child tracks.
And it was just kind of like, well, there's no mid-tarsal break, and it's probably just kids playing by the lake. And he's like, it's October, it's 20 degrees outside.
I suspect too that maybe the mid-tarsal break is something that develops in adulthood, that it's related to the weight of the creature, and that the young probably don't have it at all.
I agree completely. I've had that thought myself. I think maybe the mid-tarsal break is something that maybe develops a little bit later, or maybe after adolescence when they start putting on some real weight. Because I've seen tracks, the ones we found up by Little Twin Lakes. We found, were they 13 inches? I think they were 13 inches, which isn't outside human range, but I don't remember them having a mid-tarsal break. Yeah. But it's still like for a Squatch, that's probably, small, either a small female adolescent, younger Squatch. 13 inches is probably on the small side for them. And it might not be, that might not be breaking the mid-tarsal break territory yet.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I don't think we should expect a young Sasquatch track to just be a scaled down adult version. That doesn't really make sense.
Yeah. And, I've heard a few sightings where people were like, it wasn't what I expected. I expected to see Patty, and I saw, the silhouette of like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo or something, and very thin, lanky thing. Yeah.
A Native American. Yeah. Yeah. We do hear that.
But I think, people come in all different shapes and sizes. I don't think there's any reason why they wouldn't either.
Nope. Different sizes, different hair colors, different skin colors, hair texture.
Yeah. Yeah. And, Patrick, he was described by someone in the book. I believe that they were telling Mr. Foosh. Is it Foosh? Foosh?
I say Foosh.
Foosh. That he was a pinhead. Yeah. And ladies and gentlemen, if you purchase Before Patty Volume 1, you will get to see Patrick. There is a photograph that Norm, through his diligent research, dug up. And when I read Pinhead, like I immediately had an idea, everybody knows, well, not everybody, but you think of the circus, the pinheads. And I don't know if that guy knew what a pinhead was. Maybe he didn't know and just kind of made that, he'd heard that name and thought maybe that was associated with somebody with a funny shaped head. But that is not Patrick is not a pinhead.
No. No, I just took it to mean he thought of Patrick as having a small head, which looking face on, he does seem to have kind of a small head. And he also has a compressed neck. So this would have been a relatively small head, kind of down more on the shoulders, which probably gave him an odd appearance. But then he would turn his head and he has a slightly extended skull case in the back. He has literally a shelf in the back, an overhang of skull. Um, so when I did a lot of work in AutoCAD, of all places, trying to compare Patrick's cranial shape with a couple of controls, a couple of normal people scaled to his height. Um, in the end, I had to conclude he probably had about the same volume of brain as somebody, a normal person of his height. Um, so I think the pinhead claim was more just an appearance, an effect of his odd shaped cranium
Yeah.
rather than actuality.
Well, when I think of pinheads, I think of the circuit, the people in the circus with they kind of have a normal shaped like lower part of their head, but then their head like tapers up,
A
and so
cone head, yeah.
yeah, but
Yeah.
that's not at all what Patrick looked like.
No, he had a quite a sloping forehead. He had the impression of not having a lot of brain up here. Um, so his eyes were relatively close to the top of his head rather than being lower, like in the pinhead
Yeah,
situation you're talking about.
one of the most jarring things that I took from the photograph of Patrick was the placement of his ears. Um, and it's
Yeah.
not really one of those. I mean, you can look at it and then you say, "Man, that there's something looks off about that guy." And then when you mentioned it, I was like, "That's it. It's the ears."
Yep.
And it's funny because you can look there. There's pictures of some of Patrick's family in there too, his offspring, and his son. One son looks. I mean, his ears are fine, but his daughter. There's one picture where you can see her ears, and I think she has almost the exact same ears as Patrick. Like it almost looks like they're just as low as his. But it's hard to see because you don't when she's looking this way when it's the full face picture. Her hair is covering her ears, so you
Yeah.
only get to see him in profile. But yeah, it's interesting how one maybe he took after his mother or something like that, and she took more after his father. I don't know, or her father, but yeah, it's interesting how just but not bizarre, but just how unusual that he looks. And I'm curious. Do you think Patrick knew that about his cloudy origins, or do you think he was maybe not afforded that information?
I think he must have known in the end, maybe not as a child, but later. And one of the reasons I think that is I suspect they were unable to keep that a secret from much of the other residents in that town. And you know how kids are, they're just terrible to other kids. I suspect he was taunted with that, the poor guy. I don't know, but I suspect, just the fact that 90 years later, there were people in that town that could still remember Patrick and the story about how he had a Sasquatch father. Uh, I think the story got out there. Interestingly and fascinatingly to me, part of this whole movie we're talking about, Chief Joseph lived in the same town. The Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce that led his people on that amazing chase with the army on their tail and almost made it into Canada in northern Montana. He lived in that town. I suspect Chief Joseph heard the story. Uh, he would be quite the bit character in that movie to have Chief Joseph as part of this story, and I think he was.
Yeah.
Um, I
Oh,
think Patrick did know. Um, I think that was probably pretty hard on him uh, to know that about himself. Um, and I think that's part of why he always gave a different birth date. There were so many birth dates associated with him that he volunteered for official documents. Uh, I think he was very determined not to let it get out if he could help it. but I think it was an open secret.
Yeah. Yeah. That would be an awesome scene where there's like some kids chasing him down the street, and then Chief Joseph like comes out of the store. Hey, you kids knocking. He tells them
I like
tells them a
it.
tells them a story about how the Scanicum are just like them and shouldn't be taunted.
Well, maybe you got your next writing project. It's a screenplay of Before Patty Volume 1.
No. Yeah, it writes itself, man. Um, yeah, I think you talk about all the hardships and stuff on the reservation, the smallpox pandemic, the and then later on the tuberculosis. I went and toured the sanatorium there in Louisville. I can't remember the name. It was Waverly Hills. It's supposed to be haunted, and they've got these pictures of because they thought back then, which it's true. They thought that fresh air was a good for tuberculosis patients, which is true, but they said no matter what, they're getting fresh air. So there's pictures in the like before you get into the building where they have their little like museum. There's pictures of patients laying in hospital beds, and there's just literally like snow on top of them where they just like at 6 a.m. they'd wheel them outside onto the veranda and just leave them there all day. And there was pictures of them with like there's snow on them and everything else. So they'd wheel them out there no matter what the weather was and just leave them
God.
because they thought the fresh air was good for them. And it's funny, like, that not that long ago in the grand scheme of things.
It was the vitamin D. Yeah, vitamin D is supposed to be good to fight tuberculosis. So if they could get sunlight on them, that'd be great. But it doesn't really do it if you have blankets up to your chin and the sun is at that angle and it's cloudy with snow.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a good thought. They were on the track of something.
Yeah. I had a tuberculosis scare. Oh, I don't know. It's been many years ago now, but I was
Oh,
working at the PD here, and the health department called, and they were like, "Hey, you know, any guys that were working on this date, this date, this date, and this date, you might want to have them come to the health department for a free TB test." And turns out somebody in town had tested positive for TB, and we had just happened to have had contact with that person on those dates. And
uh,
I actually like picked the person up and transported them to the hospital in my car at one point, and I had to go get a TB test to make sure I didn't have TB.
well, yeah, you
So
share the same air. That's the way to
yeah, it's
transmit it.
it's still around. It's still out there.
Yeah, prisons. Yep, it is still out there. It was very harsh for Native Americans. It killed a lot of Native Americans when Patrick was growing up, including a couple of his kids. His sister died of tuberculosis. His mother may have, I don't know, but she may have also. Patrick's mother died when she was about 44. Uh, so Patrick was somewhat on his own. He had a stepfather that amazingly apparently stuck with him, accepted him as his own. Um, Patrick's mother's husband did not abandon his mother, Hayasiat. He stuck with her, and I think he was a big important element in Patrick's life. Pierre Paul, that was his name. Um, but you mentioned hardships on the reservation. Patrick's school burned down at one point Christmas Day. I wonder if there was maybe a little bit too much celebrating or something going on, but his school burned down. It was closed because of smallpox. At another point, it was closed just because the two chiefs at that town were not supportive of education. So they closed it down because there just weren't really enough kids to keep it open to justify the cost. Patrick was only able to basically get a second grade education, and yet he could read and write. He was also described by that same ranch hand informant that you mentioned with the pinhead comment as being actually quite intelligent. And one thing that probably caught your eyes, it did mine, he described him as a hard person to play cards with because he always seemed to know what was in your hand, which, we
Yeah.
we hear some things about Sasquatch. I just thought that was interesting. To look at Patrick, you'd think, boy, this guy probably isn't very smart, but he was actually very intelligent, and that itself was probably rough on him as he grew up. With a second grade education, he was unable really to better himself. He had to take care of his family eventually by picking hops and getting day labor. It was not an easy life. He developed an alcohol addiction, particularly after his stepfather died. I think that's when it started really kicking in. Um, and one of the reasons I know so much about Patrick, he got in trouble with the law many times, um, many times. And that's how I got his picture that you mentioned.
Yeah.
In 1928, he was arrested and he had some mugshots taken. And
Yeah. I wanted to mention there's a couple of times where you talk about some of the times he got picked up by the law, and there's that invest charge there.
yeah,
That means
ah,
he's held for investigation. Uh, so probably what it was is they didn't really know what they were going to charge him with yet, so they just put that in there until they figured it out.
why didn't I just call you and ask you what that means?
I don't know. I was wondering about that when you were like invest. I don't know what that means, and I'm like, it means held for investigation, um, which I
I
don't know. I
figured
mean,
it was investigation, but I didn't understand that meant, yeah, we're kind of stalling until we can see what we can really charge him with.
yeah,
Uh,
because you can. Well, I mean, the law is different in every state, and it changes all the time. But a lot of times, you can just say, "Look, you're not under arrest. You're being detained for investigation. We're going to hold you here," and then maybe, especially in the case of somebody that's drinking and being rowdy, you've got to. We're going to stop this right now. You're going to jail. You're going to jail, and then we'll figure out. Like we'll come back and talk to the witnesses in a minute. After we get you guys off the street and
ah,
secure, and then we'll figure out what we're going to charge them with. So a lot of times, that invest on the charging in the charging documents means investigation. It's held for investigation.
okay, that makes good sense. Yeah, that all fits. Uh, yeah, he had quite a life. I can't recall it off the top of my head how many times I know he was arrested, but I bet it was in the mid-teens anyhow. It
Let's
was
see.
a lot
There's
of times.
the map. Let me see.
A geography of Patrick.
Oh, where's that? I got it right here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's 11 spots on the map. So every spot is at least one night in jail.
I don't know if you caught that, but there was one day he was arrested twice in the same day. The first time he was arrested with his wife. The second time she managed not to get caught up in the second arrest. But twice in one day, which is it's I don't know, it's a shame.
I've seen it happen before, but maybe once or twice in a 20-year career.
He was a character, and yet he lived, I believe, to be 70 years old. Um, and he probably, I suspect he carried tuberculosis for years. He might have even infected one or two of his grandchildren, which I hate to think he did. But I think he carried tuberculosis, but that didn't kill him. It was a heart condition that got him in the end. And his poor, long suffering wife, who separated from him for years in the Seattle area, um, understandably, he was trouble. She only outlived him by about 6 months and died of the exact same heart condition when she did die. And she was younger than him, so he actually lived longer than her. There's so many ironies and tragedies in the story.
Yeah.
It's remarkable.
Well, I wanted to ask you about, I think you said he had 8 children, which is, when you're a farmer, you back then, you supplied your own workforce sometimes. I wonder sometimes if that's why he has that many kids, because at that time, maybe he was working a farm. But a lot of his kids, he outlived. And I wonder if maybe his Sasquatch heritage had something to do with that. Like maybe it just they weren't as viable for some reason. Maybe I don't know. It just seems like a lot of his kids died prematurely.
Well, I would actually kind of flip it a little bit. Um, I think at that time, sadly, and this is tragic, and I'd love it if this book made people more aware of this. I think that was the norm for Native America at that point. I think it was really tough to get your children up to adulthood. I tuberculosis, the smallpox, various other diseases, poor health policies, few doctors, um, a lifestyle that went from being outside almost all the time to being stuck in these tiny little government houses, crowded into them. It was a very unhealthful way to live. I think what isn't remarkable so much of his kids dying early, I think it was him living so long. I think that was remarkable. And I wonder if that was what's called hybrid vigor. If you take two dogs, two pedigree dogs, and you breed them together, the results are mongrels and they can be all over the place in appearance, but they tend to be healthier. They've gotten rid of some of the genetic diseases that the two parents had. By you don't have that chance of the two recessive genes coming together when you take two dissimilar variations of the same form. You get rid of sickle cell anemia, for
Yeah,
instance.
that's a good point because I have French bulldogs and they have a lot of health problems. In fact, so much so that before I got my first French bulldog, somebody that I knew that had a French bulldog was like, "If you're going to get a French bulldog, get insurance, get health insurance." And we do. We have health insurance on all the dogs, and it's paid for itself probably over the years. But yeah, that's a good point. But also, with genetics, it's it's a dice game. You never know what you're going to get. So it just makes me wonder, like, if you just need that perfect storm, if there's something about that scanicum DNA, it just needs, if you maybe mix it with European DNA, oh, not so good. But if you mix it with like Native American DNA, it's like, oh yeah, okay, we're good. I don't know. It's who knows? We'll probably never know. But yeah,
I did speculate in the book that the death of Gabriel, his last son, that possibly that was related somewhat to the Scanicum heritage because it was a brainstem aneurysm. I didn't understand what that meant. I had to research it a little bit. But basically, where the spinal cord comes to the bottom of the skull, he had just inside of the brain, he had a vessel pop. It created swelling in that part of the brain, and the brainstem actually was pinched where it goes through the skull, which just completely destroys all the I forgot the term, but the thing that controls like breathing, heart rate, etc. It just sends it into a storm. He died very quickly, but I mentioned already Patrick's strange cranial shape and configuration. I wonder if that involves some congenital defect in his son Gabriel. If he also inherited some of that and it didn't work so well for him. So that is one case in the 8 children where I do wonder if the Scanicum genes didn't cause some problems, but I don't know.
yeah. I mean, it's hard to say, and all we can do is speculate. But yeah, I think you're right. It was hard back then for Native American and kids to thrive. I mean, there's all the disease and just the bad hands that they were dealt, and just yeah, looking back on it now, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. But with Patrick, of course, it's amazing that this story, like you said, Mr. Foosh has just basically it's not out there. It's not out there like Albert Osman or anything like that. It's kind of been, I don't know, ignored. And I'd like to see somebody take a really a good look at it. But at the same time, I don't think we need to be tracking down Patrick's family and trying to get them to spit in a cup or something. Although somebody probably will. I think there'll be some Bigfoot altist out there that'll be like, I know who they are, and I'll go.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
Yeah, I'm afraid you're right. And I'm going to feel terrible about it when it happens. Yeah. I had to read a book from Russia to hear about Ed Fuchs's paper. It was mentioned in a book from Russia by Dr. Igor Burtsev. And I saw that and I thought, well, I got to try to find it. And it's online. I believe I sent you this morning the link, and feel free to include it in any show description.
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes so everybody can read it and see what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Poor Ed. Ed didn't have the greatest life either. There was tragedy in his life I didn't even put in the book because I couldn't think of any non-salacious reason to include it. But he had some tragedy in his life, and I think he was probably a brilliant guy. He was quirky. He was peculiar. He apparently knew Dr. Grover Krantz of Washington State University out of Pullman, Washington, which is nearby. So he was communicating with Grover Krantz. He was also in communication with Dr. Debinet, who was, and maybe he's probably still alive, a French researcher. I think he's more of an anthropologist or some related field, but he did write a book on Sasquatch in North America. So he knew him as well. But one thing that I was slow to think about, Ed Fuchs lived within about 10 miles of the last surviving child of Patrick. He lived very close to her. I can't believe that he did not interview her. And I remember in his paper, he describes her as not looking particularly unusual. Even though with the other kids, he was very quick to say, oh, he had long pointed ears and really long arms, etc. I think he met her, and I think he abided by her wish for him not to put her into the paper specifically. But she was right there. He was talking to distant relatives. They claimed to be distant relatives. They would have known where she was and where she lived. I think he met her, which is another great thing in the movie.
Yeah. Well, it makes you wonder, like, if there's some files out there or interviews or something that
Yes,
maybe Ed's family might have. Yeah.
exactly. The Ed Fuchs papers. Yes. He actually lived in. He bought an old school in Riverside, Washington. He lived in that school, and he did his crazy mad scientist stuff in there. He was doing hydroponic tomatoes before anybody was talking about that sort of thing. Debinet was quick to say only tomatoes. There's nothing else going on. But yeah, I would imagine this is the kind of guy that had files and files, boxes and boxes of papers. What
Copious
happened
notes.
to them? I think he died in 2014. It's not that long ago. There's probably a storage unit or an attic somewhere that has his research in it. That would be so amazing to get a hold of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't realize. I know you mentioned it in the book, but I'd forgotten that he had died so recently. I thought he would. Huh.
Yeah, Heather found his phone number. It still hadn't been taken out of service. It
Oh, I
was
think I remember. I remember her talking. Like, I called and nobody answered.
Yeah.
I think I
Yeah, it
remember her
just
saying.
kept ringing and ringing. But Rhett, what's his name? He did get his phone number and got a hold of Ed before he left Riverside. Ed died in Arizona in the end. But yeah, there is a lot to the story that could still be uncovered without even going to the ancestors, the descendants, excuse me, without going to them. There's things about his mother's tribe. I would love to know, or clan or band. I would love to know her heritage. She was a bride purchase, which is amazing to think we got a story going here where one of the characters is a bride purchase. There was literally an exchange of money or goods to transfer her from her family to her new husband. That's
Yeah.
we're touching on a different time in America.
It was a
The,
different
the,
time.
it was, the Columbia was not yet dammed. The Columbia was free flowing with salmon, sturgeon, trout all over the place. That's how they made their living. That was their lifeline. And that's, we destroyed that lifeline with the dams. Another thing that hit those particular Indians in the Great Basin. That was tragic. Another
Yeah.
tragedy.
Yeah, I've never made it over to the reservation in Colville. I think Will said he's been on there a couple of times. He's taken a couple of reports from there. But yeah, that area, it's so beautiful, but it's, man, it's squatchy. There's some thick forests in there. If you go to Colville, the town of Colville, and you go to the Walmart and you look across the street, there's just, that's where the logging operation is, and there's just stacks and stacks of logs of trees. Just,
Yeah.
I mean, 5-10 stories high, just as far as the eye can see. And that area where we filmed Bigfoot Encounters of the Northwest, that area got logged. I went back there a few years ago, and that whole area back there, and that area where we were hearing a lot of the activity, it's all gone now.
Oh, and that's the constant story, I think, for whatever's living in our woods. Areas get logged, they got to find a new place. The trees start growing up, they're coming back in. Um, in the book, we haven't talked about this, but I suspect, I don't know, if Sasquatch is that closely related to Homo sapiens, I suspect the diseases that just devastated Native Americans, First Nations people, Alaska Natives in North America, I suspect they had a similar effect on Sasquatch. And that
It wouldn't
what
it
we're
wouldn't
seeing
surprise me.
now is their population's building back up again. We're not logging as much. They're coming back into areas they haven't been in maybe for generations. And there's a little bit more of conflict with the hairless ones. They're coming into contact more. They're trying to establish themselves. We're trying to still hang on to our rural communities where maybe they'd rather they got them. Um, we can see a little bit of conflict in this period right now.
Well,
If anything, I'd say Sasquatch, though, is very restrained. Um, I have a remote cabin. I suspect I've had some activity up there. Funny things are going on. And it would be so easy to chase me out of there, but they don't. Um, they put up with me, and I'm grateful. I feel a little silly, but I'll leave apples and things, and I hope I'm making friends with them. I hope I'm on their good side, because I do not want to be on their bad side.
well, I know when the owner of Area A was talking, I think to Doug Hychek about the activity on his property, it came up not in the initial conversation, but eventually it came up like, yeah, that it was, that area was logged about 100 years ago, and Doug was like, oh, like that is a major green flag, for something about areas that have been logged like a long time ago. They're ripe for Sasquatch activity, I guess.
I, I think over much of North America, they're coming back. Yeah, with
And
reduction logging activities
I
and with
want to
good.
I want to say Thomas Seawood has talked about the disease thing. I can't remember
I
what he said, but I feel like he's touched on it before.
Well, him being Native American, uh, Native Americans, for instance, they got freaked out about COVID, understandably. In the book, I talk about the Great Dying. Before Anglos even really started exploring the interior of North America, uh, disease had raced ahead of them, had just leapfrogged across the country, and had wiped out, they think, up to 90% of the populations. And the clans, the tribes that were left behind that lived, they were a mess. They lost a lot of their cultural heritage. They lost their elders. They had kids growing up without their parents. It left them weak. Anglos never would have made the inroads in North America if disease hadn't
Yeah.
done the dirty work.
What was it? was it Cortez? I could be wrong, but he met the Incas, saw their like city and stuff. They're all and went and was like, oh my god! And when goes back and he's like, oh my god, you guys aren't going to believe it. It's these huge cities and it's full of like thousands of people and all that. And it, months later, because of ship travel, and he comes back with some more people and there's like nothing there. It's like they're all gone because of the diseases and stuff. So
Yeah, and that happened over and over again in both Americas. Um, and we don't we don't really take that into account. Even as people interested in Sasquatch, we don't think about what might have happened to their population.
yeah, well, I know the guys from the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. They've talked about like if and when they take a type specimen, basically they have protocols set forward to where they're gonna like because they're like, yeah, obviously they probably don't have any defenses against our diseases, but what if they have diseases that we can get? So they allegedly have a biohazard policy in effect for if and when they take a type specimen, which
And a
I
bloodborne
don't.
pathogens program, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we're in any danger of that. I think we're creeping on 20 years now, and the search continues. So
Oh,
when I first heard about those guys, I was like, man, this could be it, like any day now. And I think here we are 20 years later, and I'm like, I don't think it's going to happen, dudes. I think they've actually changed their mission now from instead of trying to take a type specimen, I think they've gone back to trying to take a picture of one. But
huh.
I don't know. I haven't followed up with them in a long time.
You probably recall there's a chapter in Before Patty, Volume 1, in which I entitled it The Type Specimen. And I personally believe we had the type specimen, but we didn't realize it, and we kind of bungled that as a scientific body. Although Dr. Ivan Sanderson and Dr. Bernard Heuvelmans, they did have 2 days to examine um, the Minnesota Iceman, which a colleague of ours, Michael Thompson, actually saw himself. He thinks it was the original. I'm not sure if it was or not, um, but they had about a 6 foot tall entity frozen in ice. They made sketches of it. They took measurements. They could smell the decomposition of the corpse that was in the ice. It had been displayed at fairs and carnivals. This was pretty much about the same time that the Patty film was taken. And I think it was an adolescent Sasquatch. I think that's what that was. And I think probably it had been shot in Minnesota. They made up all sorts of stories to kind of cover for
Yeah,
the origin of it.
wasn't it a Vietnam rock ape at one point or something?
Yeah, they said that. They said it was found floating in sea ice by Russian or Japanese whalers. There were like 3 different stories that came out, all designed to hide, I think, what really happened. And probably was an adolescent. I don't know why it worked that time, but shot
Yeah.
in Minnesota somewhere.
We're, we're once again normally run into barriers of reporting.
well, probably the fact that Ivan Sanderson and Bernard Heuvelmans, they're examining this thing and they decide, whoa, I think this needs to be in the Homo genus. And Homo is literally human. And suddenly the owner realized, oh my God, I could get into a little trouble over this. So he started spreading stories of the origin and then actually got rid of the body and put in a fake in its place. He tried to imitate it as best he could. But I think there was a switcheroo there because he got scared he'd get charged with murder in the end or get into some other trouble.
Yeah. Remember, kids, it's never a war crime the first time. No, I say I'm pro kill. I need to change that. I need to say I'm pro type specimen. I'm pro moral, ethical type specimen. Like if it's self defense, if you come upon a dead one, that's fine. I don't think we should shoot one just because. But I don't think anything's going to change until a type specimen is produced.
I think you're probably right. I think this is a lot like UFOs. The disclosure is actually going to come one person at a time. I don't know why. I can't explain it. But I think there's going to have to be a critical mass reached
Yeah.
before it's accepted as a real entity. And volume 3, frankly, is about the weird stuff. There are some strange things, like you're bringing up the type specimen. Why hasn't one just had a heart attack and keeled over? And that could happen in somebody's backyard. Why hasn't that
Yeah.
happened?
Or why hasn't one like gone blind and wandered into the downtown, Moose Lick, Alaska or something?
Yeah, yeah. And you do occasionally hear stories of like young ones. They're desperate. They go to people for help. I don't know why one in that situation hasn't really turned up. Um, it's one of the things we, as people who are interested in Sasquatch, and I mean we being the viewers too, we got to come to terms with. What
Yeah.
is going on here?
Well, I don't know. I think some animals can sense intent. I think uh, maybe they can sense those people that will treat them right and won't treat them moral or right, and maybe they avoid those people. It's like there's that story about the guys sitting around, and the squirrels are just driving them crazy at camp, and the one guy says, I've never had squirrel, I've never eaten squirrel. And the guy goes, oh, really? Well, hold on just a second. Let me go get my rifle and we'll have squirrel for dinner. And he goes back to his truck, gets the rifle, comes back, and all the squirrels are gone. It's like those things have been
Yeah,
pestering them all day. And the guy goes and gets the rifle and the squirrels disappear. What changed?
yeah, his intent changed. He was intending to shoot one, and he had a rifle with him.
And I've
Why
had
are
that.
those?
I've had that here in my on my property. You get a nuisance animal and it just pesters you and pesters you, and finally you're like, that's it. I'm going to unalive this thing, and then you never see it again.
Um, Still, I bring up my heart attack scenario. Humans show up dead now and then through random accidents. Um, I don't get it.
I
We
don't know.
should
I've
have.
never. I mean, I don't know how much time I've spent in the woods. It's a lot, probably not as much as you, but I've never found a random dead, you know, bear. I found some moose parts occasionally, but not a whole just a moose laying there dead. But yeah, I know there's tons of moose. There's probably more moose here in Alaska than people, and I've never come upon a freshly dead moose.
You know, I had one show up at my cabin. I'd been making frequent trips up. I had not been gone more than 2 weeks, and it was just bones. And what was scary, and you would understand this, Beans, it was 20 feet off my trail. And then you think about, well, why did that moose die? And if the timing had been off and there was a grizzly on that moose as I walked 20 feet by, we wouldn't be having this conversation probably. Um, but it's true. I do know one guy, though, he did find a dead grizzly cub. Um, I do know one guy that happened to. But you're right. To find a bear that died naturally, that's pretty unusual.
Yeah, I would
But
love to find a bear skull or some bear claws, and it's just never happened. I've always been on the lookout, but I know what'll happen is I'll find one and I'll be like, I should have bought a lottery ticket. like, like, that would have been the week.
yeah, yeah. I don't know what's going on, Beans.
I don't either, man. I've always been a pretty hardcore flesh and blood guy, but I don't know. I hate to say it, but man, something's going on. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. We got to be careful. We can't jump to conclusions, but there's a lot of weird stuff. And it's been pointed out the weird stuff parallels UFO reports as well. So there's like this blurring eventually in the paranormal end of things between Sasquatch, which seems like a very real creature, and the little green men. Um, and, and that's more of the book 3 subject matter. In book
Yeah.
2, I actually, going back to the flesh and blood, I think I can make a good case for a reasonable explanation for Sasquatch from an evolutionary point of view. I'm even working on a paper right now that had its origins in this book. that I'll put up at myacademia.edu site. But I think we can make a good case that it makes sense, that it's not so astounding as we might think that there is such a thing as Sasquatch.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, for everything you can come up with, like the bulletproof Sasquatch. You know, my personal theory on that, if you know how Kevlar works, it's very densely woven fibers. You know, all you need is some really dense muscle, and it could act as a natural Kevlar or a layer of, you know, flubber, if you will, or blubber, uh, mixed with that. You know, very dense musculature, and you've got like a natural Kevlar. So, you know, there's things that we can rationalize and you know, come up with, like, well, how do you explain they're bulletproof? Well, you know, there's a lot of, there, like, bears are pretty bullet resistant from the front, if you shoot them in the head.
yeah, yeah, I did hear one account. Um, to me, it was tragic, but a guy described shooting a Sasquatch at pretty much point blank range in the chest, and it was fairly young. I think maybe it was no more than 6.5 or 7 feet tall, and he described it as falling backwards, and it started bleeding from the mouth, very flesh and blood. It then staggered off and fell off a hillside or something, and he was freaked out. He left.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. And then of
and
course, yeah, you get the ones that aren't as bulletproof. And then what's is it because he was so young? You know, he hadn't developed that musculature. Is it because it was such a close range? You know, I don't know what caliber the guy had. You know, there's a saying, Norm. There's no such thing as bulletproof. It's bullet resistant, because
yeah,
there's a bullet out there that will get through there. You just got to, you know, you just got to find the bullet.
yeah. Well, I agree. We're probably going to need the type specimen again, but have we had it and they just disappear? Is that really going to convince people if it's whisked away right away? Um, I I don't know.
Yeah,
What do you
it's
think?
gonna have to be something that, I don't know. It's gonna have to be something that is everybody can see, but, you know, trusted researchers get to take a look at, not just Bigfoot researchers either. It's going to take outside researchers, but video evidence isn't going to do it anymore. Even with like AI, you know, even with some of the stuff the government just recently released in the UFO files, you know, there's already people like, that might be AI, and but
No, I
yeah,
agree.
it's just yeah, I don't know what we're going to do, man. I think your book here though is an amazing dive into this story, and
Well, thank you.
the amount of research you did is very apparent. It's very meticulous.
Thank
I
you.
I love. I mean, everything, the bibliography on this thing is huge. There's so many books that were referenced and cited, and it's just a very time. I could tell a lot of time went into it. A lot of love. It's a work of love, Norm. You made a book, baby.
Thank you very much. It was. It's my baby.
But I think, yeah, I think it's a very good book. If you're into Bigfoot, you should definitely check it out. Where can they get it, Norm?
This book, an easy way to get it is go to beforepatty.com, and that has links in it that will take you through either independent booksellers or right to the great beast, Amazon. It's available in ebook through a couple different routes. It's in paperback through two different sources, and it's also available in two different versions of hardcover. So you can take your pick. But beforepatty.com is easy. I think if you even just Google before Patty and maybe throw in Norman Soley, I think it'll pop up immediately. Should be easy to get.
All right, sounds good. People, please check it out. There's so much in that book, and the story of Patrick is so captivating, and it's just so, man, it's amazing that this has kind of flown under the Bigfoot radar for so long, and it just hasn't been gobbled up. But Norm got his hands on it, and he researched the hell out of it.
Well, thank you. Thanks for helping get the news out.
Yeah. Well, like I said, people, beforepatty.com, check it out, pick up the book, support him so we can get Before Patty Volume 2 and get some more meticulously researched information.
All right. It
All
will
right.
be.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.